Alright, as we close out on adaptations from Night Shift, I think we're going to go into what is probably one of his more famous movie adaptations, to say the least, which would be Children of the Corn, which is a movie that I was afraid of for a long time. Not necessarily because I knew much of anything about it, but it was actually, and I don't know how he feels about, me telling the internet this, but this was pretty much the one singular movie that my dad was always afraid of, and last I checked, still is. And it's and he's of course faced some teasing from my stepmom, who likes to say Malachi's name just randomly. Sometimes it's kind of like watching them do the Leprechaun Wayne's World bit, and it's hilarious. Uh, so I finally did see this somewhere in my teenage years, like when I was maybe 14 or 15 or something. And yeah, it didn't like scare the shit out of me or anything, but I get it. Especially if it's like the one singular movie one person would be afraid of. It's like, because sometimes we just have those random movies that get to us in a way for one reason or another that we can't quite explain. This I could see falling into that category, and it's a case of, as far as the adaptation goes, we've touched on a lot the fact that more often than not, usually the story ends up being more effective than the movie, given what you can do in text and what your imagination can do versus how the adaptation does with that. But with Children of the Corn, I think it's interesting because I think the story and the movie really complement each other really well. Because for everything that, the movie does wrong, the story does right. But on the other end, anything that the story might do wrong, the movie usually ends up doing right. Pretty much starting off with something that I think is a great change, and a much better change that the movie did, was how this couple, Bert and Vicky, basically the chemistry between them and how they interact before everything goes down and then while everything is going down. Because in the movie, they're pretty much still in like a honeymoon phase of sorts, but they're obviously like really in love with each other. She's goes out of her way to celebrate his birthday in the morning, and then there's the whole thing where she calls him a jerk once or twice in the movie, and he just kind of laughs it off, and they have a laugh about it. And it makes the characters easy to stick with as we go through the story. We're not, just saying like, oh, or when are they just going to off these people already? Which you might be saying when you read the story, because in the story, they've been married what seems like a while. I can't remember if they specified or not. But, they really, really hate each other, and he especially hates her a lot. And we're not always entirely sure where that's coming from. It's mostly just that's how long they've been married, and it's not working out. They've basically been talking about divorce leading up to when the story starts. Like, she's talked to a lawyer already and stuff like that. And yeah, and then they just are at each other's throats for most of it, even when they probably shouldn't be. It's like, I've made it clear how much I love King and his writing throughout this, but these two are probably, while it's a strong story for the most part, the two main characters in it are pretty weak, especially when you compare it to the story surrounding them. And there's a whole lot of like very unnatural interaction here. Like he's almost trying to play it up like they're the bickering couple in any circumstance, or they'll make smart-ass comments to each other, even when they're toting around the dead body of a child that they have run over, that they discovered has his throat cut. And it's easier to, do the suspension of disbelief thing in a book, I think, because when you're actually watching it play out in a movie, it becomes much easier to, like, be critical of it. But here, it's like she'll say things like, once they run over the kid and he's just laying in the road, there's a moment in the story when, like, bitterly she says, now you can tell all your poker buddies what you bagged in Nebraska. And it's I don't know, it's like they're still trying to do that thing that they were before, and you would think this would completely change the circumstances, and maybe that was the point, is that that's the way the characters are in literally any circumstance. But it gets not just old, but it gets weird and out of place when all the shit really starts to go down. And I like that the movie was able to make them. Just in general, it's a relief that they just like each other in the movie after you've seen the way they act with each other in the story. And there's like multiple times where he talks about how he's, wanting he has to grip the steering wheel so he doesn't end up hitting her, but he does end up hitting her anyway. And it's really off and kind of weird, and kind of takes away from the focus of what's really going on whenever they're together. So there is that, but something the story does that's great, that the movie may not entirely be able to live up to, is just the kind of atmosphere in general, and the fear that the whole concept pretty much puts the word fear into atmosphere. And the thing is talking about when he's looking at like the corn at the start, and he's talking about how you could just literally like walk into that and immediately get lost, and it sort of reminds you of the story that he would co-write later with In the Tall Grass, and how they kind of played with that concept. But for the most part, on top of saying that that's how everything looks, and the way that they build up to the children rather than showing them right away like the movie does, is it really gets to play with this whole angle of that feeling of being watched, and the fear that comes from that, and the paranoia that comes from that. And it's like the moment in the movie when they all like converge in the street, which is pretty much towards the end, is the first time we see them in the story. Even though the story, obviously with things added, the structure's a little different, obviously, when it finally gets to that point. But I do like the idea of not seeing them until then, and just all the build up of him like going to the church, and when he goes to the church in the story, nobody's there, and he's able to just look around and piece everything together. Um, and the movie does have the scenes where they just kind of walk around town and like have to piece everything together eventually. But the thing is with the story, there's something always tense about them just walking around and looking at things, because we don't quite know what's going on. He's keeping us in the dark, and like the clues are coming together to show that the parents are gone and it's just children, and they're doing God knows what for this supposedly religious reason. Um, and the thing about it is, in the movie, we already know, we've seen the children, we know what's going on and everything. So when they're all just walking around aimlessly, there's really no sense of, oh, what's going on or what's going to happen, and them just sort of stalking around, because it's like we just kind of, there's no real mystery to it, which is what the horror of the story was. So it just kind of becomes directionless, kind of in the middle portion there, and they're just walking around. And the movie gets so aware that this is like the point in time where the movie just kind of stops dead. Is number one, I believe he actually says to her, we need to get going and find the cops because things aren't happening fast enough. But then they also throw in a little jump scare where they run into each other in the house, just because the movie knows this is a dead end. This is just a dead stop. This is dead air. So, and you would think by looking at those details, it seems they're aware they kind of back themselves into a corner, but you think they would have written themselves out of it rather than just saying, we'll just deal with it. It's like, maybe do some rewriting in the middle instead of just saying, we'll just acknowledge that we know we kind of fucked up here a little bit. And we've shown too much too early. But at the same time, if you do want to talk about how the movie starts off and how much we do see in the movie before shit starts to go down, there is something to be had, I think, in actually being able to see the origin happen. Seeing, the parents be murdered and all of that. Even though we only see it in this one area when it's supposedly happening all over. But, they bring in this narration to kind of clean up the exposition a little bit. And this is conflicting because, obviously, when you're adapting a story to the screen, one of the first things you're going to have to deal with is the exposition that you can very easily put into a book that you can't in a movie. Otherwise, it's very blatant and it's just throws everything off. So, I don't know about the idea of the narration. I think, honestly, it would have been better if we were like, even if we were still seeing everything, like, that's pretty much like everything we're seeing at the beginning of the movie is basically a spoiler for the story. But the thing about that is there still would have been kind of an air of mystery to it if you just took the narration out. And it's also kind of weird that it's in there because it's from the perspective of that kid, but it's like when you think narration, you think we're seeing things from a certain point of view, but we're not really seeing the movie from a certain point of view or that kid's point of view. We're going back and forth between Bert and Vicky and the kids pretty much at the whole start of this, and it's, I don't know, it was an odd choice because it's so jarring when it's like we're with the kids and there's narration. It's like, oh, we're seeing it from their perspective, and then they come in and it's just normal. It's just the two of them. And then we cut back and suddenly we're back in his perspective and the narration and all that. And it's like, maybe they were trying to play up that it makes them feel more like outsiders that way. But I think it may just be sloppy structure. But if you want to give it the benefit of the doubt, you could easily probably say it makes Bert and Vicky feel a bit more like outsiders to the audience when we're not seeing it from such a perspective as we are through the kids by way of the narration. So there is that. And there's a psychic girl here, which is something that the movie has added. Like most psychic, kids or characters or whatever in movies like this, is it really going to even be that useful in the long run, or is it just there? For the most part, it's just kind of there and not really used. And more often than not, when you bring in a character like that in a story, they're just not going to be as useful as it may be built up to be. I don't know why that was a cliche for a while there, but it's still here also. Talking about some things that the movie didn't necessarily maybe add so much as build off of. Like, one of the reasons they try to build up that Bert is so sort of, like, restless as he is he apparently was in the Vietnam War, because the story is set in 1976. And they talk about how he was like a medical orderly there, when the movie has just made him kind of a straight up doctor, which is very interesting because the main actor that plays Bert is an executive producer on Grey's Anatomy. So there's that, like, for real. And so they kind of add to the character traits a little bit with that, and like I said, you can see them taking details from the book and kind of building on them, which is a really good approach to take. But then you have stuff like adding the psychic girl, not so much. And you even have, and this girl, of course, who you would think would be able to see all the danger everywhere, does the whole thing where the kid that ends up dead on the road is going to leave, and he's trying to sneak away. And of course, as he's running, the girl says, "Look out," and screams at him, "Nobody's looking," very loud, over and over and over again. Very subtle escape plan. And it's like, I've never been able to quite tell if the movie, like if that's the point of that scene, is that because he starts to really haul ass when she starts doing that, like he knows that was the worst plan ever. But I don't know if I can't tell if that's just a stupid moment in the movie or if the movie's acknowledging if that was the point. I really can't tell. If you can't tell, that's usually the bad sign. It's probably the worst option. But and as far as the movie being creepy, though, like, does it succeed at that is going to be the really important thing here. And yeah, even though we do have, like, kind of that dead zone in the middle, not to reference King by accident there, but you do have some interesting shots in this, and I do like a lot that while we do have some lame-ass, jump moments in here, and it does kind of take this story, which was very unusual, and adds horror cliches to it. Like we were talking about jump scares and fake outs and stuff like that. There's also the character, the mechanic, who kind of serves as like that old-fashioned cliche character of like the warning, where he's not so much of a warning. If anything, he's trying to downplay it. He's just like, no, there's nothing over there. Don't go over there because there's just nothing there. You're gonna go over there. But he feels like he has that sort of stance in this story. And then there's actually a really great moment where it's weird how much this movie can downplay, despite the fact that it adds in all those horror cliches and the jump scares and stuff like that. Because you have like this moment with the mechanic where he opens the hood and his dog's bloody bandana is in it. And in any other case, I feel like in any other movie, we'd be dealing with a dumb character that this is clearly a dire circumstance. But another horror movie character would scream their dog's name as if they're going to get a response. Or maybe out of desperation or something. But I love that it just immediately dawns on the guy. You can see it in his face. It immediately dawns on him that the worst has happened just at the sight of the bandana. He does not even try to look for the dog because he just knows. And he knows that he is also in danger at this point as well. So that's kind of a strangely real moment for a character that was added for a more or less cliche reason. But as far as the genuinely creepy stuff, you do have some shots here. When I say downplayed, it's interesting how much the score doesn't always ever do it, or sometimes the score is totally absent. And the score is usually the weapon of a horror director that doesn't know what the hell they're doing and doesn't want to, understate anything. Everything has to say, look how scary I am. So it's really refreshing to watch this and see where we have moments where the score doesn't get like really big and dramatic, in moments like, even though once again it does end up leading to a fake out with that pointless dream sequence where the kid in the road sits up. But that way that scene starts, when we see the shadow of who we're assuming is Malachi, sort of creeping up to the car, like while she's there, and we just keep getting shots, like whether it be shadows or in the mirror or something like that. We don't show his face, and there's not. And this is when you can tell how much it works, like prior to us seeing the kids like all the time. When we have shots like this, where it's like, if this had been, like if we did have the opening scene and it was just building up, this would be perfect to kind of build up the kids slowly without showing their faces, and only showing like, their weapons or when they're creeping up to something or their shadows or something like that. If it had been a lot of that leading up to like a reveal of sorts, kind of like we get in the story, we probably would have had a much more effective movie. But while they're here, they do really serve that purpose. There's also the moment, one of the moments that always stuck with me the first time I watched it, which was when the kids are playing Monopoly when they're not supposed to be, and Malachi's knife just goes through the board, and that's how he walks in, and it's like there's nothing big and dramatic about this. It's just the sound effects with no, and it's barely, I mean, it's you can say it's a jump scare moment, but it's not like, they're not overdoing it in a way to where it doesn't really feel like that, like a cheap moment. It feels like a genuinely startling moment to show just how big of a threat this character is to all of the other kids. Which is interesting because he's technically not even the main villain, even though he's the one that's built up to be the most intimidating. There's the moment where like literally every question they ask about a threat, the answer is Malachi, to the point that the guy just is like, yeah, we know. By the end of the movie, we know it's Malachi, of course. But I guess technically, apart from, the spirit or whatever he walks by on the rose is, our main antagonist would be Isaac. And the interesting thing about Isaac is that he is played by John Franklin, who was 24 or 25 at the time this was made, and I think most people didn't know that. Most people assumed that this was a child actor, but honestly I think that's pretty brilliant, because when you look at like Courtney Gaines and the way he plays Malachi very well, and Courtney Gaines at the time was the age, he was like 18 or 19 when they shot it, and the thing about that is Isaac is a much different character from Malachi. He's got that weird maturity about him, and he's got that real leader quality to him. But the thing about it also is that you want to ask, could a child actor have pulled that off? And it's like, well, you look at, Courtney Gaines being 18 or 19 and making Malachi as effective as he was. But if I remember correctly, Isaac in the book is like 9. So it's like, were you going to be able to find and there's some amazing child actors out there, but would you have been able to find a 9-year-old that could have been totally convincing as Isaac? And I like the fact that they were like, why don't we'll take the safe route and we'll get like an experienced actor. John Franklin, who plays Isaac, by the way, would go on to play Cousin It in the Addams Family movies. So there's that as well. And he returned for like the 6th sequel or something. The sequels to this were so fucking dumb. I don't even want to go into them. The second movie was like filled with Wizard of Oz references for some reason. I don't know. But anyway, another thing that this does is what it. I don't know if that's what it's saying, but the way it handles using religion as a horror device, which can be very effective. I know there are some people that are like only scared of horror movies that deal in religion, and I'm sure we've talked about that plenty of times. We've talked about The Exorcist and stuff like that. And there is something to that, where even though in the cases of the good people that use religion can be seen as like a comforting thing. But you also think about all the evil that's happened because of people that are driven by a religion. And that's where these horror movies come from. And you can tell, like, the people who adapted this seem to have a lot they want to say in regards to that. With all the different things here. Like, well, first off, there is the whole thing of the representation of He Who Walks Behind the Rose, how it's a figure where for most of the story we're not sure if it's really there or if it's not. Are they worshipping something that's a real force, or is it all just, just false, just everything about it? And people doing it for their own gain. There's the moment especially when they're in the church and they're doing the sort of birthday ritual, and he grabs the book and he says, did you rewrite all of it or just the parts that suit your needs? It's like, I feel like the writers definitely wanted to say something about the way religion is handled and when it's in the wrong hands. And there's something like that. And then there's the whole thing of, sometimes there's just a sort of a nice, clever line thrown in. Like when she finds the corn husk crucifix and he says Jesus Christ and she says not in my book, which you could take all the different meanings of. And so the way they toy with that kind of thing is interesting, but also doesn't feel like, it could have also felt like, ironically enough, preaching, if they wanted to really, really say something blatantly about that. But the fact that it's just kind of lines here and there, and like I guess you could say, the whole representation of He Who Walks Behind the Rose and stuff like that. But, and the fact that, Isaac is doing all these evil things, but he keeps saying, I act according to his will. And for a while, we don't know what that means. And immediately, if you're unfamiliar with the story and you're going into it for the first time, when you hear him say, I act according to his will, one thing comes to mind immediately. But then it's a whole sort of Stephen King monster reveal thing. And as we know, he does have... As much as I love King, he is obviously notorious for his final reveals being more or less underwhelming, and the fact that He Who Walks Behind the Rose actually... not only is it just... It wouldn't have been King enough if it turned out that they were just evil kids and there was no actual higher power. It had to be a giant smoke monster or whatever the hell it is. And in the face is an effect that I would say didn't age well, but I'd be surprised if that looked good in 1984. 1984, of course, the same year as the Terminator, so good for Linda Hamilton for beating both Children of the Corn and the Terminator in the same year. That takes something. And sure enough, when the girl introduces herself, of course, Linda Hamilton says Sarah is a beautiful name. Of course she does, in 1984 especially. But I do think there is still something here, even if, like... Because obviously it's always going to taint the atmosphere when a monster is revealed and it's underwhelming. But there is stuff throughout it here. Another, like, something else is the whole build-up to them coming into town and, going in circles and stuff like that. And another thing you can throw into the religious category is when they see the Gatlin sign. It's in the sign, is long ways, and it's in the middle of the pole, so it looks like a cross, of course. But yeah, when they're driving around town and all that, I just talked about in the last video, they got a hell of a band from Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And one of the things I talked about was that is also a story that opens up with a couple driving around that ultimately get lost before they end up in a town that's evil in a way. But I was talking about how I get it and I love it when stories can set themselves during the day entirely and still be creepy and alienating and all that, because the day is usually safe in horror and it's night that you have to worry about. But I had critiqued that and said that they got a hell of a band would have probably been more effective if it was entirely set at night, especially since they're lost in the woods. But the fact that they're like out here in all the flat land surrounded by pretty much nothing, the day almost makes them feel even more vulnerable. Like, this is a story in particular where it's really effective to set during the day because you never quite know when you're safe or not. And I do love the way the story used that also, where it's like when he gets stuck in the corn and he can see that it's getting dark. It's like he's playing Beat the Clock to get out of there, and he knows when it's dark it's going to get really bad, which is a really effective part of the story. But the way they use the daytime in this, I do think actually works quite a bit, especially since it just feels like nightmarish. Like, especially when they pretty much find out that they're going in circles. And that's another thing that's touched on in the story a lot, is he repeatedly says that it feels like a nightmare. Like, when he kills the first kid in the story, and it's like he's in such disbelief of it, he pretty much almost resigns to the fact that it has to be a dream because there's no possible way this could be real. And I feel like the movie could have played a bit more with that as far as how it felt. But you could also tell they probably just were dealing with a studio that wanted a straight horror movie, and we pretty much got that, hence the horror cliches that were thrown in and all that. But even so, I do still think it, stands on its own and does, like I said, even improves on some things from the story, but there's also some things that are in the story that you wish could have been more prominent in the movie as well. But, and just to top it off, not only is it kind of underwhelming when we see that He Who Walks Behind the Rose is whatever the hell that is, that terrible effect, the movie also decides to end on another horror cliche of, oh, there's one left at the last minute. But this is probably the most awkward and weird example of that in any horror movie. They hit the child with the car door, in the face, knock her out, and literally just the words "the end" pop up while they walk away in silence. They walk away from the movie. They walk away from the audience. They're like, we have nothing else to do here, so we're just gonna go. And the movie follows suit. So that's kind of, that's always been such a weird-ass ending, but there it is. But like I said, there is a nice balance here in what they do between the two, but I do think it could have served from just a little more atmosphere, and the fact, I do appreciate that we got touches of that, like the stuff of Malachi walking up to the car and the shadows and stuff like that, or him knifing the Monopoly board and stuff like that. More of that, I think, could have made this. This is a movie that could probably really benefit from this whole Stephen King remake resurgence that's been going on. I don't know if I haven't been paying attention enough to know if they are planning on it or not, but if they get, like, a really talented director, like when they got, Muschietti to do It, if they got a director, like, of that caliber that knows what they're doing, like, I could almost see, like, David S. Sandberg doing this very, very well. Actually, now that I say that out loud, I kind of really want that. But, I guess we will see what happens. It's obviously gonna, resurface at some point in the future. For better or worse, we'll find out. But in the meantime, we have one more of these left. And then I'll be done with this. It is the first story in Skeleton Crew. And if you're aware of what that is, that's going to be what we're looking at. And then we have reviews coming, and we have versus stuff, and all that other stuff that's been going on. I said, I don't know what Owen and Ash are going to do to pick up the blanks here once this is done with, but whatever they're doing will be there. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for the